evening. Welcome to the Bible Speaks today from LBC Television Ministries. And we'll pause a moment for the obligatory clattering and banging. No? Okay, well, I guess we're not going to get it tonight. It's nice to be able to get a dig in at the crew whenever you can, because Lord knows they do it to me. You should never argue with the chap who's on air, because he's got the advantage of the last word. Although I suppose they could edit the disc and cut me out or something. Anyway, for those of you who tuned in last week and thought, what on earth is he talking about? Well, it was unicorns, as you probably guessed. And before you think, well, that's not really what the Bible says today, I say, on contrary, yes, it is. Because in this program tonight, what we're going to be talking about is what we've done with those Bible translations since then. If you are one of the people that subscribe to the King James being the inerrant, that's the word I was looking for last week and couldn't get it around my tongue, but if you're looking for the inerrant word of God and you say that's the King James, then the word unicorn must be true, must be there, because it's it. And I think we've established more or less that when the Bible, the King James version of the Bible, is talking about unicorns, it is talking about what we now today call the rhinoceros. You know, the big... and what started... And I'll be honest with you, sometimes I get the inspiration for these programs from a question you send in to me, or somebody asks me a question about, well, you know, what did David actually do when he did this? Or, you know, what did Paul really mean when he said that? And my wife drew my attention to a picture that somebody had sent, obviously somebody with a little bit of knowledge about biblical words, shall we say, but it had a picture of a big old African two-horned rhinoceros wallowing in a mud pit, and it said, real unicorns have curves. I think it was a play on the big girls against small girls thing that's been going on recently. But anyway, and I thought, well, you know, that's very true. I wonder how many people know that they're referring to rhinoceros, okay? Or rhinoceroses, okay? It's just, to me, fascinating when you start looking at the Bible in a sort of offhand mentions these horns on a rhinoceros, and nobody pays it much attention. I mean, I was talking about, you know, the Moses talking about Jacob's prophecy about how Ephraim would be greater than Manasseh, all right, and saying that Ephraim is his tens of thousands, meaning people, and Manasseh has thousands of people. Now, most of us, when we do our read the Bible through, that's one of these passages where we go, oh yeah, I didn't understand a bit of that, what does that mean? And keep on going. But it's a prophecy that made by Jacob, which Moses confirms and says, look at that, Ephraim now is bigger than Manasseh. And to describe it in sort of context, he talks about the big horn of the rhinoceros as opposed to the small one. To me, that tells me that the writer, in this case Moses, had to have first-hand experience of the animal. Now, nowadays, I suppose there's a lot of rhinoceros live in the wilds, in the game parks in Africa and other places. Not too many. If you want to see a rhinoceros, you've got to go to the zoo. I don't even know if got one in the Cincinnati Zoo. But anyway, and it's not the actual... to be honest, it's a little ugly. It's a big, fat, 12, 14 foot long animal with two big horns. I mean, elephants look graceful and majestic, and other animals have their attributes. The rhinoceros and the hippopotamus, although they're not strictly related, kind of those ugly sisters, aren't they? But in Moses' time, they were pretty prolific. You know, they didn't have people with high-powered guns to shoot them down, and they're not easily susceptible to bows and arrows or spears. So you know, it gets to be a situation where the rhinoceros probably was very prolific. It could last, you know, wasn't hunted for meat, I don't think. Either way, But it's a big old ugly animal, but it's very powerful, very, very strong, and in fact, you know, kind of fast too. If you ever see one in you know, in the what do you call it, the wildlife films, they can move, they can run pretty fast for short periods of time. Okay, now one question you might have about something I said last week was that I said it makes sense that Moses would mention a two-horned rhinoceros because, of course, he was in Ethiopia, and the book of Numbers says he married an Ethiopian woman. That's Numbers 12, verse 1. If you read Josephus, I quote you Josephus all the time, but if you read Josephus, and if you don't want to buy the book, go to the library. They've got lots of copies of it there. Well, several. If you get it out, Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus, he talks about, according to him, he's the one who says that Moses married this Ethiopian woman when he traveled to Ethiopia, which is part of Africa, all right? And as I said last week, people confuse this Ethiopian woman with Zipporah, who wasn't Ethiopian, was a descendant of Abraham, okay? And as we know, scientists and archaeologists and people who know about these things have said that the black rhinoceros used to live in Ethiopia. It's not there anymore. It's been wiped out over the centuries or the millennia. But anyway, it's not there. But it was a two-horned rhinoceros, and it makes perfectly good sense that Moses would have mentioned that. He would have seen it. Okay? And of course, people say, well, you know, the Bible can't be talking about rhinoceros because they don't live in Israel today. Well, they may have done back then, but you have to have fact that the Bible doesn't just talk about what happens in Israel. People were all in the Old Testament were all over that area of the land. Okay. So, although it seems like an odd thing to be talking about, it's pretty obvious as we go right now that when the King James 1611 translation of the Bible was put out, people generally accepted then that when it said unicorn, they were thinking rhinoceros. Now, what I tried to do to illustrate this was to look at when this idea of this mythical unicorn started to arrive. And you know, I can find lots of references to early novels and things in the early part of the 19th century, but I cannot find out where or who invented, if you will, the unicorn. There are some old paintings around which purport to show a unicorn in biblical settings, but that strictly has to be the author's or the painter's imagination, because as we can see, the unicorn was and still is the rhinoceros. I imagine that at some point in time somebody thought, well, I want to show a picture of the unicorn, but it's a big ugly thing, and let's try and, you know, make it more susceptible to the masses, shall we say. So they spun it a bit, and so a spun unicorn becomes, you know, big old fat grumpy animal becomes this ethereal looking horse with a horn. I don't know, something like that. Anyway, but you know what's interesting is that there is a mistranslation. Okay, the mistranslation that we have today talks, we have this mythical, like, horse-like animal with a horn on its head, and that's not what we're talking about. The issue is that scriptures will talk about a one-horned unicorn, when some verses, according to the context, talk about a two-horned unicorn, which makes, you know, again, perfectly good sense. There was more than one style of unicorn, one with one horn, one with two horns. So in this verse, we're in an area where they're one horn, so people refer to the horn of the unicorn, and in this verse, they're talking about the two-horned unicorns. I mean, the early translators should not have written unicorns in Deuteronomy 33:17. It should have been translated rhinoceros, which would have saved us a whole lot of bother and probably negated the reason for this program. But they choose to talk about unicorn, or use the term unicorn, single-horned animal. But in fact, the Hebrew text in Deuteronomy, the Hebrew text, clearly talks about a singular animal, singular animal, that possesses plural horns, okay, which would be rhinoceros. Anyway, but the King James, these things happen, I suppose. The King James translates it in the reverse. It talks about several animals, plural, animals in plural, with a single horn. And the reason for this, of course, might be that the people who were translating this particular verse saw that the Vulgate translated the Hebrew, so Latin from Hebrew, and now to English, translated the Hebrew re'em as unicornis in a number of places, and assumed that they were talking about a strictly one-horned animal. Now you think, well, what's all this got to do with anything? The point is that when you start translating language to language, you have to understand the context of these things. We've seen in some of our more in-depth discussions looking at the Bible as it was then, as it is today, where people have either intentionally or without really understanding it, mistranslated the context of verses and words so that they end up meaning something that they didn't, or they've put the punctuation marks in the wrong place. Okay, which changes the things totally. I'll give you an example. You've probably seen this on the internet. Okay, here's the sentence: a woman without her man is nothing. Right? Okay, straightforward. You can see what it says. Without a man, a woman is nothing. If you put a comma in there, okay, a woman without her, another comma, man is nothing. Changes the whole concept, doesn't it? Very simple, just a matter of grammatical interpretation. And with translations, you get the same problem. You get things, people assume that this means that, so they say that. Okay? So, when the translators saw that it was horns in the plural, they decided that in order to fit the context correctly, they would translate the singular Hebrew word, re'em, which is, as a plural English word, unicorns. And it's not, it's unicorn. It's just a simple thing like that, okay? And as I say, a singular noun shouldn't be translated as plural. I mean, there are times when in all languages, we'll talk about Hebrew and English at the moment, but when singular Hebrew nouns must be translated as plural nouns when they refer to something that's in plural. Okay? But they must have, if you will, a grammatical basis and not just on context alone. That's a bit deep, I know, but look at it this way. In Genesis 1:1, it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And what's the Hebrew word for God? It's Elohim, okay, which means literally gods, plural, okay? So why, when you translate it into English, doesn't it come out, gods created the heavens and the earth? Well, the reason is because there is a Hebrew verb bara, which means he created. In other words, one person created. So what they did was, although the word means gods, it identifies Elohim as a singular. So they translate it as a singular. Okay? Regardless of the fact that in actual fact the verb is plural. And there's a Latin expression for it, I can't remember what it was, but it means grammatical structure. Okay? But in Deuteronomy 33:17, there is no grammatical basis for the singular noun re'em, meaning unicorn, to be translated as the plural noun unicorns. You can't translate a singular into a plural just based on grammatical context. It's not good. So therefore, this verse in Deuteronomy 33 is talking about a two-horned rhinoceros and not a one-horned rhinoceros. Okay, so we learned a lot about one-horned and two-horned rhinoceros. Now, at the beginning of the program last week's program, I said that we were talking strictly about the King James, because if you look at modern translations, you will not see this. Now, those of us who use the King James, I do sometimes have more than one Bible, and as I said in the early stages last week, I cross-reference them to see what each one says. It's kind of interesting, actually. Sometimes you think, is this the same verse? But anyway, the modern translations, right, will say that where they have unicorn or whatever they've got in there, they will say wild ox. Okay, and that's because today's Hebrew scholars, and Lord knows there's a lot of them, believe that Re'em, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's R'(EM), is a type of wild bull. Although they're, to be honest, and I've looked at a couple of discussions about it on the internet, they're not absolutely sure. They think that's what it might mean, but you know, they're not sure. Okay, so modern translators, here we go again, translated as wild ox. Now the King James guys, not modern, but trying to do the best job they can, translated it as what it was. Everybody in 1612, after they got the Bible in 1611, understood perfectly well that a unicorn was a rhinoceros, right? In 2011, I'm not quite sure everybody understands that. Okay, well you do now because you've been watching the program. All right, but in Psalm 92 it very clearly says the animal has one horn. Well, I don't know if you've seen any wild ox recently, and we'll come to that term wild ox in a minute, but I think you know what I mean. You know, the big old shaggy haired thing with the huge curly horns. Well, you know, there's two horns, unless of course it lost a horn somewhere. So that doesn't make sense, does it? How can you be a wild ox when you've only got one horn? Okay. Well, Deuteronomy 33, as I keep going back to, says that the animal has two horns. Okay, so whatever the Re'em is, whatever it is, it must be an animal that could either have one or two horns, which makes a perfect setup for a rhinoceros. There's one horn and two horn. Okay. And rhinos, by the way, are often called bulls. Like you have bull elephants, you have bull rhinos. Okay? So from somebody writing about a bull unicorn is talking about a rhinoceros. If you watch Animal Planet or Discovery or one of those, what was the old program years ago, Wild Journeys or Wild Safaris? Anyway, you'll find that people, scientists I suppose, and naturalists, refer to an adult male rhinoceros as a bull. Therefore, the rhinoceros perfectly fits the picture that the King James is putting out. Wild ox does not. Again, this is translation. When the modern translators tried to look at this, they thought, well, unicorns, rhinoceros, wild ox, okay? We'll do that. Well, there's no such thing as a wild ox. Do you know that? Do you know what the definition of an ox is? And it's not the big old guy that walks down the street with a t-shirt on and that sort of thing. No. The definition of an ox is a domesticated, right, bull. In other words, it's a wild animal that has been domesticated. A wild bull is an ox. Okay? Oxen, the two oxen pulling the cart and that sort of thing, right, are domesticated bulls. Be they got long horns or short horns or no horns or whatever, they're domesticated bulls. Therefore, the term wild ox, if you do it literally, means a wild domesticated bull, which in anyone's words is an oxymoron. Okay? You can't have a wild domesticated bull. It's either wild or it's domesticated. No. And you say, but it might be a domesticated bull that has gone wild, in which case it's a wild bull. Okay? It's like, I read something here, it says, that's like salty fresh water. You know? If it's salty, it's not fresh, is it? Okay? There's no such thing as a wild ox. But modern translators have done that. They've changed the meaning of the words. Now, who are we to believe? If Moses talks about a rhinoceros or a unicorn, and it means rhinoceros, why don't we leave it alone? Why do we need to change it? What prompted the modern translators to feel like rhinoceros was too hard a term for us to understand? I understand it, and even if I don't think I've ever seen one for real. Maybe I did in a zoo when I was a kid, but I've seen pictures of it. In fact, as my director was saying today, I wish we had some pictures we could show them to you. But really, what's wrong with the rhinoceros? Because by the time modern translators started, and I'm talking about within the last 100 years, started to translate the Bible into the new IV or whatever it was, the image of the unicorn had become fixed in everybody's mind, which was one of the reasons I said last week, if you have young children who happen to sit up and watch this program, then you probably should put them to bed, because I'm going to disturb their ideas about elves and unicorns and fairies and hobbits and the rest of it, okay? I mean, there's some wonderful fairy stories written about unicorns, okay? There's some wonderful pictures. I think there's a couple of movies about them somewhere around. I'm sure there is. If somebody can think about it, they've made a movie of it. But they don't exist, not in that sense of the word too. But my opinion is that by the time the modern translators came across this unicorn, rhinoceros type translation, okay, they decided they would call it a wild bull, because nobody wanted to say, well, unicorns don't exist. It's almost like the myth takes over the reality. To let you in on a thing for a couple of weeks' time, we're going to be talking about angels. I don't want to get into it now, but what people think of as angels today, the big tall geezers with the long white shirt and the wings and the halo, bears no resemblance to anything in the Bible describing angels. Cherubims, seraphims, all those things. They describe them in the Bible. They do not look like the things that we have as angels. I mean, I've got one hanging in my car. You probably do too. But that's nothing like what angels said. But what happens is imagination and mythology take over in such a sense that people believe that that's what they look like. Those of us who've been lucky enough to see one. I think we probably see angels every day, guiding us, protecting us. We just don't realize it. Anyway, I digress. But that's sort of what I'm trying to say. The unicorn, the image of the unicorn is the white, purely white, no sin thing. I mean, it's been used as an image for Jesus Christ in innumerable books and paintings. And yet what they're talking about is a big, fat, squat-legged, hairy animal that's got two ginormous horns made of hair sticking up out of its nose, which unfortunately people now kill them and cut them off because they're considered an aphrodisiac, which is sad. And so when translators start to translate the Bible, recent ones, I'm not talking about 200 years ago, but within the last 100 years or so, by the time the unicorn myth had become prevalent, rather than say, it was a rhinoceros, they call it a wild ox. There's no reason at all to call a rhinoceros or a unicorn, a rhinoceros in another name, as anything else but what it was. There just is no reason other than to make it palatable. And sometimes translators throughout the ages have read things in the Bible that they felt was too much for the populace to hear in its unrevised, unedited terms. So they do that. They tone it down, or in some cases heighten it up. And saying that the King James Bible is the inerrant word of God is fine if you say that the unicorn is a rhinoceros. If you can't accept that, then you're having a problem with the translation of that book. What's interesting to me is that the translators of 1611 got it right, and when Tyndale and the others translated it into English, and they translated it as unicornus and rhinoceros, they got it right too. But later on, 200 or 300 years later, oh, now it's got to change, because people don't sort of fit the image. So remember that. The unicorn of the Bible was, is, and always will be, a rhinoceros, be it a single horn or a two horn. And go and look at your natural history book that your kids have probably got, or grab your kid's tablet and dial in rhinoceros, and you'll see a whole lot of information. Okay? Now, not necessarily a great Bible teaching program, other than to understand that things written in the Bible sometimes have a lot more meaning to them than you at first realize. All right? As I said, in a week or two, I'm not sure if it'll be next week or we'll be talking about angels, and I'm sure you've all got something to say about that. So until then, read your Bibles, look up and see what it says about angels, and I'll be with you shortly. Good night.